Before the success stories, the progress, there was you. You who made a choice to grow, to inspire, to overcome your own challenges. At NASM, we're in service of your limitless potential, because when you keep growing, we all get stronger, and we'll never stop making your journey our mission. Join the fitness leader. Become a fitness leader. Become a certified personal trainer.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of the Master Instructor Roundtable. I'm Marty Miller here with my co-host, fellow Master Instructor, Wendy Batts. Wendy, how's it going?
Great, Marty. How are you?
Good. You know, I was looking forward to this week's topic, kind of because it's almost like NFL season. And of course, my Bills had a big injury today, not a hamstring, but this was kind of when we talked about it. It would make sense to go over this because we're kind of in that time of year where our favorite teams are getting ready to go. And all of a sudden, there comes the rash of hamstring injuries.
Indeed. And I know based on what you and I have done pretty much our entire career, this is one of the ones that seems to be the most common. I would say ACL probably first, but hamstrings a close second, whether it's a strain, injury, whatever the case may be. As many of you know, I used to work a lot with professional baseball players. Marty, I know you did as well. Running to first base, people would pull a hammy all the time. And the first thing they would do is go and stretch the hammy to try to make it feel better. So hopefully after today, you may have second thoughts on that. And we will go over some of the reasons why.
Yeah, let's jump into it. Because, you know, even though when I was last in professional baseball, 2007, this was a big topic. And I'm shocked that there's still some issues today. Gotten better, but we'll get to it. So first, we're going to talk about the common causes of hamstring injuries, right? We have to talk about that. Correlate these hamstring injuries, shockingly, to movement assessments. They are predictable. And then discuss corrective exercise strategies to decrease the rate of hamstring injuries.
All right, so I'll go into this one. We have already said it is one of the most talked about complexes for sure. I know the hip flexors are probably a close second. And so we are going to go through some of the anatomy with it to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about. However, when we're talking about the injury prevention and treatment, the injuries are widespread and they're still increasing, especially in soccer. So we're going to use that, I know, with a lot of the research throughout this presentation specifically, but they're consistently the most common time of loss of injury in the sport, especially in soccer. And this continues to be because the physical demands of the sport, they've increased, but you also have to think about the sport of soccer. You're not just running in a sagittal plane, you're moving in all three planes, you're switching directions very quickly. And depending on your position on the field, it will also let you know why you could be at more risk than others, especially if you're running at fast speeds and full stride, which I know is also something that we're going to talk about. Makes sense.
It does, but yet people still don't quite know exactly how to attack it. So when we look at the hamstrings, like I always joke with people, they're like, oh, my hamstring hurts or my elbow. Those things don't exist. And what I mean by that is those are layman's terms for a complex of tissues or bones that make up a joint, et cetera. So when we talk about hamstring, we have to dive deeper into it because there's not a hamstring muscle. So it's a group of, I'll say four. It's three main muscles, and then one has a long head and a short head. But since they act so differently, I like to just say there's four muscles. So, and they're in the posterior part of the thigh. I think everybody knows that. Your semimembranosus and semitendinosus are known as the medial hamstrings. They start at the same origin in the pelvis, but come down and attach into the medial portion of the thigh, where the bicep femoris, the long head comes right down the back of the leg, and the short head starts to go laterally and attaches on to the head of the tibia. So all three cross the ilofemoral hip joint and the knee. So there are these two joint muscle groups. So they have multiple actions, which we'll talk about. But the key thing is to understand the functions of each one of these muscles when you look at looking at any type of hamstring function or corrective exercise strategy.
Well, and I think it's important too to note that when you're doing some of the assessments, and we're going to dive into mainly anterior and posterior pelvic tilts, that some of these hamstrings can be underactive while the others are overactive. And I think that's important because I know as I've taught this for multiple years, and Marty, you and I have, it seems like this becomes like this thought of the whole complex. It's either going to be overactive and underactive. And so I'm glad that when you were saying this on the medial side, if somebody's having some knee issues and let's say their knee dives in and their foot turns out, most commonly you're going to see weakness in the medial the medial sides of the hamstring complex, while the long head, especially the short head of the bicep femoris, is overactive because of where the origin and insertion is. So it is important to understand the anatomy of the hamstrings. You don't have to know that it's on the third aspect of blah, blah, blah. Like that part's not important, but you need to understand what it crosses and what the function of it is in order to truly be able, especially on the corrective exercise side, to make a huge impact in helping someone avoid these type of injuries.
You know, I thought I was good with anatomy. I need to go back and check out where my blah, blah, blah is. I've yet to find it. So,
well, I'm not even going to go into detail about that right now. You can see on the
your
image
level of anatomy is much deeper than mine. I didn't know we had a third aspect of our blah, blah, blah.
I'm just using that as a for instance.
No, I know. I'm just joking with you.
They get, as soon as you say anatomy, it's this
No,
fear comes into their minds.
Joke with
Exactly.
you. But you know what the key thing is, like, you know, I'm traveling right now, you can tell. And I go through the airports, watch people, especially, you know, when you're in the masses and when you see a foot turn out, there's a good chance that the short head of the bicep femoris is overactive. I'm not going to say every time, but pretty good bet.
Oh, yeah. And as a manual therapist, that's one of the places that I'm not afraid to go in and dive deep, because it is more than likely, especially because of the closeness to the lateral thigh and, you know, the IT band that's over it. When it starts to dig, the tissue starts to dig into the muscle itself, it can be a hot mess for sure.
No question. So when we look at the function at the hip, I already mentioned this, the hamstring will work synergistically with the glute max because of its origin at the hip. And this also is with the posterior fives, the adductor magnus, which that muscle can create a mess within your pelvis for sure, and your knee. Most health and fitness professionals can easily understand that hip extension, right? What the hamstring does is you're propelling yourself, pushing off, sled pushes, things like that, like you see our gentleman here on the right with a muscle guy. And then, however, the hamstrings do much more than produce force concentrically. When considering that structure, it's likely that concentric training is a very small part of what the muscle group actually does. So it has multiple functions, and that's why understanding functional anatomy, that's why I highly encourage you to take the corrective exercise course, because you'll learn more and more about functional anatomy. And this is where your level and knowledge, understanding, and being able to really hone in on your assessments takes a whole nother level.
So let's talk about like when the hamstrings work in opposition to the hip flexors. So we have to think about, we usually think, okay, quads and hamstrings, as one's overactive, the other one's going to be underactive. However, when you think about the hip flexors, if the hip flexors are overactive, it's going to tilt that pelvis forward, which then is also going to shorten the quadriceps. And so that's important to know. And that's why every single time we talk about these assessments, we're like, look at what's happening at the lumbopelvic hip complex. And so if the pelvis is not in neutral, so meaning that the ASIS, which are the two bone structures in the front of your hip, if you can find those, if those are tilted kind of in a downward position in comparison to the back, then you're going to notice that that is going to be anteriorly tilted forward, which means the hip flexors are in a shortened position. Well, this is where, Marty, you and I have talked about this, and I know that there's other slides, but when you have that anterior pelvic tilt, oftentimes people will go and say, oh, my hamstrings feel like they're tight. Well, they are in a tight position, but they're in a lengthened position. So they're being pulled from end to end. And so, you know, it's important to think about what's happening at the pelvis, because then, especially as a personal trainer, corrective exercise specialist, whatever it is that you are, if you start to notice these things, you can easily start to stretch the quads and the hip flexors to help realign that, and then go into strengthening the glutes to maintain that. So it's important to kind of think, is it the chicken or the egg? Well, if people are sitting a lot, people are running a lot, they're doing a lot of things to shorten those hip flexors, there's probably a good indication in your assessment that they're going to have a low back arch, which is even more of the neutral arch. That's a huge indicator right there that that anterior pelvic tilt is present.
Right. And a simple example, people say my hamstrings feel tight. I joke when I say this, I don't care what people feel. I care what my assessment shows me. Because if Wendy, you and I were in the same room and we each pulled on an end of a rubber band or a band, exercise band, it's going to get longer, but to us, it's going to feel tighter. So that's where I listen to what my clients feel, but I have to really let the assessment speak to me even more sometimes than the feeling, because it could be a neurological tightness because the body doesn't want to lengthen any further because it's worried about snapping in a sense.
100%.
So I'll jump in here, Wendy. So as the center of mass moves anteriorly, so going into the anterior pelvic tilt, the hamstrings have to engage or tense up to provide the necessary balance and stabilization. So they do a lot of work, right? They obviously do things concentrically and eccentrically, but they will also stabilize. So if you're maintaining a forward lean position when you're brushing your teeth or over the sink, or if that's your work position, this relies predominantly on hamstring tension. So it's in that lengthened position, but it has to tense up to help maintain your pelvis from falling over, right? So this is very important because a lot of individuals in a sedentary society have that anteriorly shifted center of mass. This changes their posture, and likely the reason there is that chronic, as I mentioned a couple seconds ago, that hamstring tightness that they feel. It's a lengthened tightness, a neurological tightness, because the muscle's been pulled on and it has to guard and stiffen to help maintain your balance. And plus it doesn't want to go much farther potentially because the actin and myosin are far enough apart where it's worried about causing some type of tissue damage as well.
So let's look at the NASM course and the curriculum. As you know, we're going to go through what you need to inhibit, what you need to lengthen, what you need to activate, and then integrating everything back together. But when we're thinking about specifically hamstring work, they are eccentrically decelerating hip flexion and knee extension. So this motion is encountered thousands of times per day. Think about when you're walking. And so when you're walking, those hamstrings have to lengthen. And so you're thinking about how often are they helping decelerate that movement? Well, we're doing this multiple times a day. And so it's really important to think about the motions of what that does. And the maximum hamstring lengths occur during the late swing phase of sprinting. So if any of you guys watched the Olympics, you saw some of the track and field. These sprinters, when you're looking at their strides, there were some individuals with these strides that I could only dream of having. And you've got to think that late swing right before your foot hits the ground, that hamstring is in a completely lengthened position and it's going to propel you forward. So right before that foot strikes the ground, that's when most strains can also occur if that pelvis is anteriorly tilted and it's already in a lengthened position, and then they're running using those hip flexors and they're already overactive. There's not a lot of give left, because as Marty said, if we were holding the string and we're playing tug of war and we're pulling it end to end and you can pluck it, there's a difference between tightness and being taut. And so that muscle is taut. And like you were talking about the neurological side of it, Marty, it feels tight. However, what is it actually doing? And if we're pulling a string and then we add more force, like such as a stretch or an overstride, that's when we really start to see the strains or these major injuries occurring in that hamstring complex.
Yeah. And then even, we're talking about the biomechanics, but how many people truly teach the hamstrings to decelerate as well, or as part of a drill and as you get into the PES? So we can also tie in why the PES, and we just launched a new version of it, is so important, because teaching those muscles to fire rapidly as decelerators is critical also.
100%.
Mm-hmm. Glad you agree, Wendy. So as we move forward here, making hamstrings matters worse, if you can imagine that. The issue of hydration. So when we look at this here, it's not to say drink more, get your electrolytes. We're just kind of talking about addressing that constant sitting. It's really destroying the tissue. It's almost like you're inhibiting it at all times, right? So, looking at the quality of your tissue being in that chronically sedentary position. As we move, muscles, contract, things move, fluid moves, etc. So the pressure from sitting for hours a day forces water out of the tissue. And then if you look at the image here, think of it like squeezing a sponge constantly. Eventually a sponge will be dry. And then when you place the sponge back in water as much as you like, but until that pressure's off, it's not going to soak up that water as much. So we have to consider that. And that's why we have our obviously we want people active all the time. That's why we want people doing their proper warm-up, foam rolling, doing vibration to bring that fluid back into the tissue, allowing that tissue to relax so it can be as healthy as possible. So for all of you joining us now on the Master Instructor Roundtable, myself, Marty Miller, is here with Wendy Batts, and we are talking hamstring complex, but really why this complex is one of the most commonly injured soft tissues for the athletic population.
Yeah, I like the sponge analogy. I was like, when you put that in there, I was like, all right, I get it.
Right. A visual, a picture says 1,000 words.
Yeah. And I think too, when you talked about sitting, additionally, the hamstrings have such a large movement arm at the hip compared to the knee. When you're sitting and you're in a slightly stretched position, you're adding that tension on the hamstrings. So like you were saying, you're not going to increase the amount of water when you're in a stressed, lengthened position. So in order to get the water back into the hamstrings or the fluid, you're going to have to, shocker, Marty, stand up, move around, and try to rehydrate yourself and your tissue and your body. And I'll tell you this, as people are aging, we're decreasing the amount of water intake. I know the elderly population, when I talk to some of my active seniors, they're like, Wendy, I don't drink as much water as I used to because I have to go to the bathroom all the time. And I get it. I totally get it. However, it's extremely important. But you mentioned, Marty, when you're using tools such as the percussion device that you see, so whether it's a percussion device, I'm a huge advocate for vibration therapy, whether it's the massage gun or the foam rollers. That's going to help increase, obviously, blood flow, reoxygenate the tissue, and help with really getting your body back into a better lengthened position if they're in a shortened overactive position. And they're going to help push and pull and squeeze that fluid back into the muscles to, like you said, make it better and a better quality type muscle than it being dehydrated and kind of just, yeah.
Tissue health is
I don't even know how to finish that, but it's just not good.
I just think tissue health is critical, and not many people take account for it. I travel with foam rollers. I'm traveling now. I have even a little, like one of the little trigger point balls in my car, in my bag when I'm on an airplane. I'm sitting on it, moving it on my low back. I get up, I stand much. One of the, Wendy, I'm moving in a new house. One of the most prized possessions I found was a beautiful, beautiful stand-up desk. Because I wanted something that really looked nice, and I didn't want something that looked like a stand-up desk. I found it, and I'm so excited because I cannot sit. I get claustrophobic in my own body because I start to feel my tissue adapt because I'm so in tune with it. So sitting is like the enemy for me. So, but again, here's my water bottle. You know me, I drink a gazillion ounces of water a day. I foam roll every day. I use the vibration every day I can, because I can't do anything else scientifically if my tissue is not working well. It just starts with that.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to say this, Marty, because I know you and I know what your day-to-day is. I know you get up, one of the first things you do is foam roll and stretch, and you go through all that.
Hydrate first.
Well, hydrate, and then you go through your corrective exercise. I know that is something that you've scheduled in. But I am going to say, when Marty's talking about the stand-up desk, I have a lot of people that are like, Wendy, I'm going to get a stand-up desk. And then they'll come in about a month later and they start to have some of these issues. So I am going to say, if you are going to get a stand-up desk, 100% very good for you. You're going to move around. You'll fidget more. You're going to burn more calories, especially your hip flexors will thank you. Your glutes hopefully will thank you. But it's also important to think about what we talked about in the beginning slides. If you're leaned over, brushing your teeth, or slightly bent at the hip, like you're looking at your computer and you don't have really good alignment, so your feet are out and you're bent over, those can be some things that I will tell you have to watch out for, because it can lead to more compensation patterns if you're not careful. So it's very important that you're close enough to see your computer. You're not really leaning into trying to read something. So just be careful with that.
Footwear as well, if you're going to be standing all day.
100%.
There it is. There's a picture we were talking about, right? So if the hamstring feels tight, then we must perform both a static and transitional assessment. Shocker, Wendy and I talk about that, other than going through it, just by feeling. So if an individual has an anteriorly shifted posture, then a few postural corrections can cure this tension that you see there. If they're for some other postural distortion, then we have to, recognize that the entire group of muscles influence the position and not quickly resort to only trying to lengthen one, right? You target, one, but that there's a synergistic effect throughout the whole entire kinetic chain.
Yes. And you don't want that sucker to snap. And this is just going to be a quick overview. Guys, do a static posture assessment. When that client walks through the door, look at how they're standing, look at how they walked in, look at how they're talking to you. Marty and I have always said, if you're not assessing, you're guessing. You should always be assessing whether they're doing a workout, whether they're walking in, whether they're doing something on their own. And if someone does have certain patterns that you're noticing, meaning like that forward kind of anterior lean, meaning that they're flexed at the hips even when they're standing, you're going to want to note that. If you notice that one shoulder is higher or their hips, they have a big arch in their lower back, you want to note that. If their feet are turned out, you want to note that. But also when you're standing someone up, just have them stand up. Don't tell them what they're doing or what you're looking for. Ideally, you won't have the shoes on. However, if they're coming in, they're going to have their shoes on. So it'll be interesting to say, okay, you notice how they came in with their shoes on, fully dressed. Now have them remove their shoes and stand in a comfortable position, and then start to look at them from the front and the lateral. Don't cue them to stand any particular way, just what feels natural. And then imagine having a string from the ear, shoulder, hip, and ankle. Does it fall? If it's like a plumb line, would that fall straight and hit those joints in the middle? And if not, you're going to make a note of it before you get into the movement component, which is the transitional assessments that you should do next.
Yep, assessing is key. So as we move in forward here, when we look at the overhead squat assessment, you got to do this, right? Very easy, very simple. With both arms overhead, have the client squat. If the pelvis dips anteriorly on the onset of the movement, then they have that anterior tilt that Wendy talked about. We saw the imaging indicating the hamstrings may be long and, are trying to stabilize the pelvis. If the pelvis goes posteriorly on the onset of the movement, that's the key. Then the hamstrings, you'll have that posterior tilt, which means that they are shortened. So it's what happens first. Do they go anterior or do they go posterior? Rarely do they stay neutral. Usually most people have one or the other.
And remember, when you're doing the overhead squat, it's not how low can you go. It's how low can you go to chair height. Because once you go past chair height, you will go into a slight posterior pelvic tilt in order to maintain your balance and keep you from falling backwards. So as Marty said, what do you notice first? A lot of times, if you just raise your hands over your head, if they have an anterior pelvic tilt, you're going to see that if it's a lat situation. Mm-hmm. If they're, because think about the origin and insertion of the lats and what it does with the arms. However, if they can raise their arms and they have a neutral spine, but then they start to go into that squat and you notice more of that curvature, they definitely have an anterior pelvic tilt that's probably more hip related. And if you're not sure, then do the modified squat assessment with their arms down and see if you notice that. So there are different assessments that you can do to help pinpoint what's happening at the hip complex. I think it's also important to think about, people are like, well, the posterior pelvic tilt isn't as common. Well, unfortunately, it's starting to make a rise. I've noticed more and more people having this, but it's because how they're in their seated all day. Are they really curved over? And if that's the case, yes, their hip flexors are in a shortened position, but they've been in a lengthened position in their lower back, where then the way that they're in a seated position will put them into a posterior tilt. So you'll notice what or you should know, hopefully, what a normal lumbar curve should look like. If they start to come out of that curvature and they have more of a flat back, and I always say like the back runs right into the glutes, meaning that there's not this little arch in the back before the glutes happen, then you definitely want to note that, because you are going to treat, I say treat, meaning foam roll and stretch, completely different from an anterior to a posterior pelvic tilt.
Yeah, totally different strategies. That's why we have to get into the assessments. And when you look at it here, many of you are NASM certified. This comes right out of the text. This is the standard, go-to. So first we're going to inhibit, right? We're going to calm down soft tissue with self-myofascial techniques. That could be foam rollers. It could be any implement that you can use for that. We're going to look at the quads, the hip flexors. It's okay to foam roll the hamstrings, right? Because you'll still take some tension out of that lengthened muscle. And the same thing with the erector spinae. But now that's only if a soft massage ball is available, right? You got to fit the natural curve in someone's lumbar spine. Then we're going to lengthen. So then we're going to use our static stretching techniques, kneeling hip flexor, quad stretches. There's many out there, right? And then also a seated erector, spine A, twisting stretch, any child's pose, things like that that you know work. Then on the opposite side, we're going to wake things up. We're going to activate the core. The pelvis is going anteriorly, then your deep intrinsic core stabilizers aren't doing what they need to do. So we're going to focus on our stabilization type of exercise, whether it's planks, whether it's bridges, whether it's press outs or pal off presses, whether it's a side plank, all of those different type of stabilization exercises to teach the spine to be in the right position and be able to maintain that. Definitely going to go after glute activation. So you'll see that I put something in there in the core stabilization of bridge, but that's also a glute strengthening exercise. But there's a lot of variations and things you can do to target the glutes, straight leg raises, hip extension exercise, I should say, things like that. Shocking that the bridge is in there. I've already talked about that. And then integrate, get all of the muscles to play nice together. So this includes something at the pelvis. So assisted squats are great. That could be suspension trainer squats. That could be arms out in front squats, making sure that the client moves through the range of motion with that neutral spine that they can control, not flat, but also not that excessive curve.
Well, where there's the anterior pelvic tilt, we're going to talk about the posterior pelvic tilt. So we're going to go into that next. So when you're thinking about it, as Marty mentioned, you've got to think about the muscles that are overactive. And so here it would be the hamstrings, because if you go into a posterior pelvic tilt, that hamstring is actually in a shortened overactive position because it's pulling the hip or the pelvis in a backward position. So we are going to go ahead, and as you can see on here, we're going to hit those hamstrings with the percussion device and or foam roller. Same thing with the calves and the glutes. It's also really important to get the piriformis. And the reason why the piriformis is listed is because you have to think when your pelvis is turned posteriorly, that piriformis is in a shortened position, and you really want to try to keep that muscle happy, because the sciatic nerve can either run through it or beside it, depending on someone's genetic makeup. So when somebody says, oh, I've got sciatica, or I feel this shooting pain down my hamstring, a lot of times it's because of the compression that's on that piriformis that's hitting that nerve. So really important to spend some time in that area. Same thing, whatever you inhibit, you want to go ahead and lengthen. So you can take all of those muscles and go into a static stretch, spend time on those areas, 20 to 30 seconds. Make sure though, when you're doing this, that the hamstrings are in a good position and you're in a neutral pelvis. You have to teach someone how to move their pelvis, and disassociation is really hard, especially when somebody has a posterior pelvic tilt. So teaching them how to move their hips forward and teaching them how to come back and then trying to find that neutral position is going to be more challenging than you think. So you want to spend time making sure that they're getting that down pat first. Same thing with activation. As Marty said, when something is overactive, the opposing side is in a lengthened position. So we need to activate those muscles. We need them to start doing their job. So once again, the intrinsic core stabilizers, remember, that just means the little muscles that go vertebrae to vertebrae. We're doing things just like Marty mentioned. We're still going to work on the planks. We're still going to work on the pull-off presses. We're still going to go into bridges, because it's important. Even though a muscle is overactive, it's still weak. So once again, if you go into bridging, it's going to be interesting because they're going to want to stay in that posterior pelvic tilt and then lift. Sometimes in Pilates, they teach you to do that. That's done in Pilates. When you're actually doing this to activate a muscle, find neutral, maintain neutral, and then go up to get that glute to activate correctly. And then again, when you're thinking about integration, you want to think about trying to do anything that's going to get the quads and the glutes working together as they should in prime movers in a squat. So Marty, you and I talked about our favorite exercises, or something as simple as a squat to row. If you want to integrate upper and lower body, that's a lot what the integration component is re-educating the body how to work together synergistically in order to move. A huge advocate for the cable squat to row because it will help you get better movement quality, but it's very important to really focus in on that, what's happening at the lumbopelvic hip complex with both, because they're going to want to go back into what they know.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but that's where you've got to get the right muscles to calm down, the right muscles active, target these as you laid out, and then get them all to play nice. And that's where picking the right exercises is what's going to give you that success, because the body's going to revert back to what it knows. So that's why the warm up every time is important. No, you can't skip the warm up, because that's getting those muscles to calm down, the other ones to fire up. So when your client wants to skip the warm up, you're skipping getting the body ready to learn how to move properly. So that's why it's so critically important. And, I know that we kind of threw a lot in a short period of time today as far as hamstrings, but it's going to be critical, right? You've got to know your muscle anatomy and function, right? The hamstring muscle, here's what we talked about. But that's why I highly encourage all of you to take the CES if you haven't done it, because we definitely go deeper into the functional anatomy and start to bring in these muscle complexes, and it'll really help you go to that next level of understanding what you're seeing on your assessment. So you have to perform an assessment on your client, because if you're not, you have to take a stab at what they could be doing. Now, of course, I can see some things during exercises, but I have to perform assessments. And then, of course, have that proper corrective exercise plan like Wendy just laid out. So you're targeting specifically what their movement dysfunction is.
Very important. So, Marty, if people have questions, they can always contact us. You guys know that. And we do appreciate the emails that come in. I know that I've gotten a couple questions just after we launched the one with Ian asking about the PES. This is also going to be an important part of it. If you guys are working with professional athletes and you're working with people that have to do a lot of acceleration, deceleration, and moving in different directions very quickly, I think it all really does blend together. CES, know your anatomy. PES, know your clientele and know how to help keep them healthy on the field. But if you have questions about anything, you can always email me at wendy.batts@nasm.org, or you can find me on Instagram at wendy.batts13.
And my information is right here, dr.martymiller72, and then marty.miller@nasm.org for email. So Wendy, thanks for, working with me on this topic. I think it's critical, especially this time of year. We got a lot of athletes that, have a lot of high profile, spotlight on them in the NFL. We're going to see our hamstring strains, hopefully less and hopefully none for the Buffalo Bills. But, I do believe that this is very important content for our audience. And as always, let us know what else you want to talk about. So any closing thoughts, Wendy?
Well, just do the assessments, y'all.
There you go. That's always going to be Wendy's closing thoughts. Get your assessments in. So for those of you that joined us today, we always thank you. And of course, we look forward to seeing you next week on the Master Instructor Roundtable.